Ripley, once a tiny farming hamlet a few miles north of Derby, had by Edwardian times become an important thriving town. Abundant nearby coal and iron ore reserves, discovered in the late 1700s, and the foundation of the Butterley Company with its many coal mines and ironworks meant a massive influx of workers from both neighbouring villages and further afield. By the 1870s, the hamlet had become another Victorian industrial boomtown. The local big cities of Nottingham and Derby and their shops and entertainments were half a day's travel away, and long hours and low wages led to what so often happened in new and expanding Victorian towns. Ripley folk opened a range of their own cooperative stores, so successfully so that by the end of the 19th century the Ripley Cooperative Society and its new huge store had a virtual monopoly of trade in Ripley. But that changed when the entrepreneurial John Marshall from nearby Clay Cross moved into town, opening his shops and building his remarkable business and entertainment empire. This then is the story of John Marshall and his family. It is the tale of a man from a humble background whose restless energy and imagination changed Ripley forever and made him one of the most respected personalities of his day. An ambitious jack of all trades, a watch and clockmaker, photographer, builder of a working man's hostel, a cinema, a theatre, Turkish baths, and most famous of all, Ripley's so-called zoo. This entrepreneurial do-anything flair seems to have been ingrained in John's family, starting with his grandfather Humphrey, who was born in the village of Hege, now well known for its 18th century windmill. But back then it was a poor rural community where families scraped a living from the land, either farming it or mining coal from underneath it. Humphrey seems to have been a framework knitter, as well as labouring on neighbouring farms. He married a girl from nearby Duffield, and they had a large family. Humphrey's sons, James, Joseph and Richard, were colliers in the local pit. Richard, the youngest, is the one who seemed to be the first in the family to have had ambitions to move on and better himself. He married in 1866 and lived in Pickard Lane, Hege, with his father Humphrey, and in 1871 Richard upped and moved the 8 miles to Clay Cross. With the discovery of abundant seams of coal and iron ore, when George Stephenson drove a tunnel under Clay Cross while building the North Midland Railway in the 1840s, the little town became yet another Victorian boomtown with coal mines, brickworks and a foundry that became internationally famous for making iron pipes. Clay Cross was an ideal place for young Richard. Ambitious and with a talent for making and repairing mechanical things, he soon gave up mining and somehow by 1871 had become a watchmaker and clock repairer. It is possible that Richard got his interest in things mechanical from his time in the pits. He once said he made his first bicycle, or velocipede as they were called then, back in 1868, whilst a miner in Hege, or perhaps he got it from his father Humphrey and his framework knitting. Gents' pocket watches were very much the in thing, and owning a grandfather clock was a mark of a family's position in life. Photography was also becoming fashionable, and somehow Richard taught himself photography, becoming Clay Cross's first professional photographer. His first shop on Dainsmore Road was a success, and soon led to Richard finding much larger premises on Clay Cross High Street, big enough to carry out his 2 businesses. Family portraits were all the rage. Every family had to have one. The rich had their paintings, and now the ordinary man and woman could be recorded for posterity. But photography was very different and difficult in the late 19th century. As pictures of typical studios show, cameras were large and cumbersome. Sitters had to sit very still, often for 10 or more seconds. At the time, a visit to Richard's photographic studio was a big event in a Clay Cross family's life. But with hard work and determination, Richard and his businesses prospered, and he and his family became respected members of Claycross society. And by the turn of the century, he had moved away from watchmaking and photography, becoming a cycle maker and motor repairer. Richard and his wife Anne had 5 sons: Richard Jr., John, William, Henry and Herbert, all of which joined the family businesses in various ways. Richard Marshall died in 1922, aged 80, a successful and wealthy businessman. After Richard's death, his businesses on the corner of High Street and Eldon Street, Claycross, continued with Henry and Richard Jr., and by the 1930s they were advertising the cheapest and best cycles, wirelesses and gramophones, and by the 1950s it was radio and TV, and more recently all things electrical. But there's only room for so many Marshalls in one town, so Richard's son John had to move, and in 1888 he moved to Ripley to open a watchmaker's business at the bottom of Oxford Street. He was 21. Back in Claycross, John's brother Richard Jr. and Henry were showing the same entrepreneurial skills as their father. Richard Jr., following on in his father's footsteps, was both a cycle maker and watchmaker, and the Marshalls owned the premises behind their High Street shop, spacious enough to use as a cycle manufacturing workshop. Henry became a jeweller, but it seems he and his father and brother also constructed a few motorcycles. Amazingly, one called the Lily has been preserved and is still running today. Meanwhile, back in Ripley, John Marshall had married, and with the help of his new wife Sarah, John started his unique career of shopkeeper come showman come public benefactor. Ripley in the 1890s was continuing to expand. Butterley Ironworks had full order books. Ripley's hosiery companies had to recruit women workers from neighbouring towns. The longest tram line in the world had just connected Ripley and the Amber Valley towns with Nottingham. Times were looking up and there was more money in people's pockets. John's little watchmaking and jewellery shop prospered too, and by 1900 he had moved further up Oxford Street, opening 2 shops this time, a new and bigger watchmakers and jewellers, and next door to it, something new for him, an ironmonger's shop. Later on still, he opened a sweet shop for Sarah to run. The properties still exist, although now selling very different products. Someone with memories of John Marshall is his granddaughter, Valerie.
The first shop was 80 and 40.
No, 82.
1882, was it?
Well, I'm only aware of 82. It says here 82, Oxford Street. And he obviously sold that, I would think, to buy a larger shop.
It was the earlier shop, wasn't it?
Yes,
82.
that was 82 Oxford Street, yes, when he first came to Ripley. Happy is the bride, whose lucky wedding ring is purchased from John Marshall. That is the shop next door, and that was run by my grandmother, Sarah Marshall. It was a confectioner's shop, sweets, and she also did bed and breakfast for the artists who came to the Hippodrome when that was built.
Business was good, and always on the lookout for any new money-making prospects, and seeing the numbers of homeless navvies and labourers working on the many local construction sites, including the new tramway, John decided Ripley needed a hostel to take the itinerant labourers off the streets.
In 1901, my grandfather built what they called the Workman's Home. And this was to house work people, mainly Irish labourers, who came over to lay the tram tracks and new water mains in Ripley. And it also accommodated the Knights of the Road, which I think we called tramps, especially in winter. And the price was 4pence, 6pence and 8pence a night. which included use of all the cooking utensils, plates, cups and saucers, etc. And they charged 1 penny for people to go and look around, and the proceeds were given to charity, which I believe was a nurse's home. The beds were made up by a day lady, and there was a male caretaker who kept the place clean and tidy, and it slept approximately 90 people, and was always full at Ripley Fair, many sleeping on the forms in the main dining area, where the heat from the coal-fired hot plate, which held the cooking utensils, kept them warm. This is the opening of the Workman's Home in 1902, and John Marshall is on there, along with Dr. Boyle, who was a medical officer, and G.W. Bird, who was the architect. And this is another photograph with lots of the visitors who paid 1 penny to have a look around. And in his usual style, this little card advertising, if you're on the road and feel tired and think you want to rest, go to Marshall's at Ripley. You'll find it is the best. No matter how far you've travelled or in what place you may roam, the best one in the country is Marshall's Workman's Home. The home will be for the sterner sex only.
The building itself still exists, but has now been converted into smart flats. With his workman's hostel and his shops in Oxford Street prospering, John Marshall, a man of original ideas and thorough business methods, decided to branch out into a new world, the entertainment business.
One night, some pretty manly girls were rehearsing for the pantomime, while
ploughing his money and his energies into, firstly and bizarrely in 1908, a zoo in the backyards of his 3 side-by-side Oxford Street shops. And later, perhaps spurred on by the success of the zoo, he built in 1911 a state-of-the-art music hall and cinema on Ripley's High Street. As Valerie Marshall explains, the entrance to the zoo still exists, but with absolutely no clues now as to what wild animals and excitements used to be found there in Edwardian Towns.
This is the entrance between the 2 shops, and that's the entrance down to the zoo gardens at the back of the 2 properties.
There was an aviary with exotic and multicoloured finches and nightingales from Africa, Brazil and the Himalayas, a monkey house, an aquarium and lots of stuffed specimens. It had a performing bear called Little Roosevelt, a talking alligator, lemurs and raccoons, a performing seal, parrots, fish and rare creatures from all over the world. At the time, most Ripley people had never seen in real life such animals, and with a tea room and refreshments run by Mrs. Marshall, plus a hall of mirrors, a waxworks, a museum and something John called a hall of laughter or fun factory, the zoo soon became one of the greatest attractions of the area, bringing thousands of visitors to Ripley. It was unusual, spectacular and a grand day out, and all at a penny per person. Many local schools had educational trips to learn about nature, as Valerie Marshall recalls.
This is a school party being shown around the zoo and seeing the animals, and I hadn't seen anything like that before.
Yeah.
And I believe they were allowed in free. This one there again is on the roof of the first one of the buildings, and then you climb up to yet another building. I don't know about health and safety in those days, but and there are the stairs, and this was a viewpoint where you could see 50 or 60 miles, I believe.
Virtually every square inch of space behind the shops was used for cages and aviaries and the Natural History Museum. Some buildings had flat roofs with solidly built platforms where children could take rides on roundabouts while their parents took tea and refreshments or climbed up to the viewing platform. Now, more than 110 years later, drone photography shows how much John and his family managed to squeeze into what were, in reality, their 3 small backyards and turn them into a garden and zoo. The drone also shows something of the views which could be seen from the very top of the zoo buildings by the crowds of curious visitors. Publicity was vital to keep visitors coming, and in 1908 there was no television or social media to publicise the zoo, and John had to advertise in the local newspapers and print handbills which were given out on street corners in Ripley. Ripley's annual October Fair brought in thousands of people from Ripley, Heanor, Ilkeston and even Nottingham, all keen to enjoy the fun of Ripley Fair. Thanks to John's racy handbills and adverts listing the zoo's very latest and most fantastical attractions, a visit to Ripley Fair also meant for lots of people a visit to John's Ripley Zoo. Always on the lookout to make money, John regularly introduced new attractions which visitors could marvel at, such as a waxwork model of a certain Thomas Burgess, famous as the second man after Captain Webb to swim the English Channel, or be tickled pink by the very latest laughter machine, or pose for a portrait taken by John's own patented photographic process. John, like his father Richard back in Clay Cross, was also a photographer, and he and his father have left a unique and remarkable collection of photographs and film of the zoo and the Hippodrome Cinema, as well as Victorian and Edwardian life in Clay Cross and Ripley. The Ripley and District Heritage Trust holds an archive of these and other photos of life and people in Ripley, which provide invaluable reference material and information for present and future generations. Sadly, the zoo lasted only 7 years, with the onset of the First World War making it difficult and eventually impossible to obtain food for the animals. The zoo closed in 1915. Jack Marshall, John Marshall's oldest son, became in effect the zookeeper, as he had a natural affinity and great skill with the animals, as the many pictures of him with his charges show. He respected the animals, and they seem to have accepted him. The most notable and troublesome was a bear called Little Roosevelt, who could be quite vicious. It once broke out of its reinforced cage and threatened to escape into Oxford Street, but it seems Jack wrestled with it and overpowered it, returning it to his cage. The early years of the 20th century saw a phenomenal growth in music halls and theatres. People wanted to be entertained, whether it was a little show in a small town or the music hall stars in the grand city theatres. They flocked nightly to see and hear the novelties of the time, the popular songs.
Mrs. Moore, please don't have any more.
It was the 5-minute farces.
People who own rent the brokers, man and gun. We always leave a house to let before the rent day comes.
The conjurers, the performing animals and the comics.
A little mouse walking along the pavement on Piccadilly there, and a woman frightened it, and he stepped off the curb and got knocked down by a bus. Picked himself up, went across the road, went into a music shop. Said the man behind the counter, "Do you sell mouse organs?" And the man said, "That's funny. That's funny you should say that. We had a little mouse in here yesterday, and she wanted mouse organs." The little mouse said, "I know who that was. That was harmonica."
They marvelled at the skill of the dancers and the acrobats. And they whooped and whistled at the primitive and juddering films. John Marshall's zoo had shown the need for places for Ripley folk to go and be entertained. So in 1911, John Marshall bought and knocked down the White House, a dilapidated property on High Street, and built a 390-seat combined cinema and music hall, which he called the Hippodrome. Great attention was paid to the design and construction of the building, even to the extent of hiring specialist plasterers all the way from Italy to help with the interior decoration. The local papers were fulsome in their praise, acclaiming its beautiful Rococo-style interior and comfortable red velvet seats, available at the very reasonable prices of threepence, sixpence or ninepence. The so-called general arrangements were quoted as being of the most complete character, and Mr. Marshall was to be complimented on bringing such an asset to Ripley. It was opened on July the 28th, 1913 by a Mr. Alton, a well-known Ripley character. As the local papers announced, it had twice nightly performances, so that the conveniences of both the working classes and traders alike would be provided for. The grand opening was headed by a certain Goody Layton, who claimed to be the world's youngest ventriloquist, and included an act called the Mannequins and their miniature vaudeville theatre, as well as two sisters, Violet and Ivy, called Leylands, and to close the show, Sissy Vadell, advertised as a popular comedienne and dancer. And from the very start, like many other theatres at the time, it showed music hall acts and silent films together. This was the golden age of the music hall, and most of the night's entertainment was taken up by the variety acts, with the short and primitive films of the time being little but novelties shown between acts. The artistes, selected and booked by John, would arrive and be collected from Ripley Station every Sunday and taken to their lodgings. Until 1927 the films were silent, with normally a pianist accompanying the films, but John often employed a local six-piece band to accompany both the films and the acts. The Hippodrome immediately became an overnight success, especially popular with colliers and the local factory girls and women. There were all sorts of novelty acts and turns, including the famous Little Titch and his 3-foot-long shoes, as well as all the usual variety acts such as dancers, magicians, comedians, singers.
But I never forget I'm a lady, and there as I lay down the ground, handsome young men with green socks and blue eyes,
jugglers, trapeze artists, whistlers, conjurers, mind readers, and a one-time world champion wrestler oddly called Little Hackenschmidt. Nicknamed the Russian Lion, he earned a living as a strongman and wrestler, touring the music halls, giving demonstrations of his strength and offering to take on any local challengers. There were also entertainers such as Pete Rhodes, billed as the original singing miner, and at great expense and all the way from America, Charles Ousley, billed as the original American coloured star vocalist and clog dancer, being the greatest dancer of the day, with his feet insured for £1,000, and not forgetting a lady entertainer who did marvellous things with 6 ferrets. The Hippodrome was also where Ripley folk in the days before radio and television saw what was happening in the big wide world outside Ripley, with the aid of weekly film newsreels such as Movietone News. It is also difficult now to realise what a novelty films and the cinema were back in the 1900s. Pioneering filmmakers like the enterprising and now rightly celebrated duo Mitchell and Kenyon travelled all around the country filming ordinary people coming out of factories or going about their daily lives. Seeing yourself on a screen was almost a magical experience in those days, and people gladly paid to see themselves in their local cinema. Mitchell and Kenyon actually filmed workers coming out of both the Butterley Company and the Crossley factories. Seeing how Mitchell and Kenyon made money selling their locally shot films, and the popularity of the weekly newsreels at the Hippodrome, and with his and his father's experience of photography back in Clay Cross, John decided to make his own local newsreels. The cost of a cine camera and its associated equipment must have been high, but making his local news films helped fill the Hippodrome. And as such, he was probably unique in making his own local newsreels in such a small town as Ripley. Sadly, only 3 of these films now remain. So, thanks largely to John Marshall, Ripley got the cinema bug. It was a new and exciting window on the world, somewhere new to go to with the family or the girlfriend, somewhere to be amused and entertained by the likes of Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and by cowboy films and romantic dramas, or frightened out of their minds by gruesome horror films. Such was the Hippodrome's popularity that in 1919 land at the back was purchased and an enlarged second Hippodrome was built at right angles to the first. It sat up to 900 people, with one of the largest stages in the area, the first Hippodrome becoming the entrance and foyer, and its balcony being boarded over to make another of John's enterprises, the Elite Dance Hall. As the years went by, films became longer, and by the 1920s most films were so-called two-reelers, lasting for 20 minutes, and were becoming as important as the variety acts. As of now, anything new in entertainment was looked on with suspicion, and John Marshall was reported as saying, "Only the best films will be screened.
What a beautiful morning.
Nothing objectionable or offensive
Girl, you're
will
lovely.
ever be shown."
Yes. Very.
And later, as silent films were replaced by talkies and the growth of Hollywood, there was the chance for Ripley folk to see all the great stars and the feature films of the day. Sadly, John Marshall died aged 71 in 1939. As a genial and imaginative and hard-working entrepreneurial businessman, he bequeathed Ripley not only a jeweller's and ironmonger's, a sweet shop and a hostel, but its famous zoo and magnificent Hippodrome Theatre. He played an important part in Ripley's history, a charitable man, always helping local charities, putting on free shows during the general strike and organising charity shows for the local hospital. As a young girl, Valerie Marshall has vivid memories of the Hippodrome in the post-war period.
Well, firstly, the cinema was left to the 3 brothers, my father, my Uncle Richard and Humphrey.
Right.
So it was a joint thing. I remember going in there free, having a complimentary ticket. I remember taking my friends there. I remember going for my piano lessons down Shirley Road, I think at the time, and coming back and slipping in just for half an hour to see the end of a film.
You go. Where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
I always remember how lovely it was during the intervals, because the usherettes used to go around the whole of the theatre and spray, sweet-smelling whatever, I suppose, to freshen it up, and that was rather nice.
In 1946, the Hippodrome was sold to a major national cinema group and carried on showing films. It was where hundreds of children queued up for the Saturday matinee, and the place where many Ripley people, when young, went with their boy or girlfriends on a Saturday night. Stop and ask a Ripley man or woman of a certain age what they remember of the Hippodrome, or Tonkers, as it later became known as, and you'll get comments like, "It was where I saw my first film, E.T., or it was the first place where I got to talk to the woman who became my wife, and we had such happy times there." time and technology have led to the end of the little local cinema. Now it's large multiplex cinema complexes with enormous car parks in the big cities. The Hippodrome and so many little theatres and cinemas like it have closed or disappeared. All that remains of this symbol of Ripley's past are some new houses and the soon-to-be renovated facade of the Hippodrome to be kept and hopefully cherished as a reminder of John Marshall, a remarkable local man and his family.